The sound between islands keeps its own calendar. That's what Nora Voss's father used to say, standing at the wheel of the mail boat in the gray hour before the mainland dock came into view, watching the water change color where the cold came up from below. He said the sound ran on different time than the rest of the world, that the tides were the same as everywhere else, but the temperature, the current, the life in it, those moved by their own schedule, one that you had to learn by crossing the same water in the same season for long enough that the pattern became something you felt before you understood it. Nora was 63 years old. She had been crossing Penobscot Sound for 26 years. She had learned the route from her father, who had run it before her, and she had run it without interruption since the morning he handed her the wheel in the summer of 1998 and went below and never really came back up. Not because he was sick, but because the boat was hers now and he understood that you didn't hover over something you'd given away. He retired to the house above the dock and spent his mornings looking at the water he no longer crossed. He died in 2009. His logbooks were in the wheelhouse when Nora took over, and they were in the wheelhouse still. 14 volumes, going back to 1971. Tide notations, weather observations, watercolor records, wildlife sightings, whale positions marked in pencil on small hand-drawn charts of the Sound. The kind of record that doesn't mean much in a single entry. It means everything across decades. Nora had kept her own log from her first crossing. Her father had given her a blank notebook and said, "Write down what the water does, not what you think it's going to do. You'll be surprised how often those are different things." She was still surprised sometimes, which was how she knew she was still learning. The Sound was a deep water passage between two main barrier islands, roughly 4 miles across at its widest. Cold water upwelled seasonally from the basin floor, driven by temperature differentials her father had first documented in the early 1970s. When the cold water came up in late spring, it brought prey. When the prey came, the whales came. When the whales came, you gave them the right of way and planned your transit accordingly, which meant knowing when they would arrive almost as well as they knew themselves. She had been crossing this Sound for 26 years. She knew when the whales came, which was why, in the spring of her 59th year, she noticed they were late, not dramatically late, not gone, 2 weeks behind the first year. She noted it in her log and moved on. Late springs happened. The upwelling responded to conditions she couldn't always predict, and the whales followed the upwelling. So if the upwelling ran behind schedule, the whales would too. The second year, they were 3 weeks late. She went back to her father's logs and then her own, pulling every whale sighting from every May and June crossing since 1971. The pattern was clear. The whales arrived between the third week of May and the first week of June, with almost no variation across 5 decades. The upwelling triggered it. The upwelling ran on the same schedule every year, driven by the seasonal temperature differential between the cold basin water below and the warming surface above. 3 weeks behind schedule was not a late spring. 3 weeks behind schedule was something else. She didn't say anything to anyone. There wasn't anything to say yet. She had 2 data points that deviated from a 50-year pattern, which was interesting but not explanatory. She had learned from her father that the water gave you context before it gave you meaning, and that the difference between the two required patience. The patience was harder than it used to be because the offshore wind project was coming. She had known about it for 2 years before the environmental review began. The developer, a regional energy company backed by a state clean energy initiative, had been doing preliminary site assessments in the Sound since the previous spring. She had seen the survey vessels, small research boats, mostly, doing bathymetric work and water column sampling in the deep basin. She had noted them in her log with the same brevity she used for whale sightings. Survey vessel in East Basin, 0830, bearing northeast. Survey work was survey work. What she hadn't known, until the state environmental review was announced, was that the developer had selected the deep basin as the installation site for a 47-turbine offshore array. The basin, the same deep water zone where the upwelling originated, the same zone her father had first documented the cold water thermal layer in 1974, was, according to the developer's site assessment, ideal for wind energy installation, consistent wind exposure, adequate depth for fixed bottom foundations, sufficient distance from both island shorelines to minimize visual impact, Nora read the environmental review notice 3 times. She opened her logbook to the whale's sighting data. She sat in the wheelhouse with the engine idling, not going anywhere, until her deckhand Petrie knocked on the door and asked if everything was all right. She said yes. She told him to cast off. She did not say what she was thinking, because she was not sure yet what she was thinking. The exploratory borings had been conducted 18 months before the environmental review was announced. 4 bore sites in the deep basin, each one penetrating to the bedrock anchor layer required for fixed bottom turbine foundations. Standard site assessment procedure, the kind of work that happened before environmental review, not during it, which meant that by the time anyone was asked whether the borings had affected anything, the borings were already 18 months old. Nora knew about the borings because she had logged the survey vessel that conducted them. Research vessel Aldrich in East Basin, multiple anchor sets, 0700 to 1630, bore equipment visible on deck. She had not known what they were boring into. She had not known there was anything to know about it. What she understood, assembled across 4 seasons of logbook review and one long night with her father's 1974 entry open in front of her, was that the basin floor was not simply deep water over bedrock. Her father had documented a layer. He had written about it the way a careful observer writes about something noticed without understanding. Cold water rising early today. Basin floor must be holding temperature differently than the surface layers. Something dense down there keeping the cold. He had not known what it was. He had written down anyway. Nora was not a geologist. She did not know the technical name for a sedimentary formation that functioned as a cold water thermal reservoir, trapping and slowly releasing deep cold water to drive the seasonal upwelling above it. She did not know the precise mechanism. What she knew was that her father had noted the layer in 1974, that she had been observing its effects every spring for 26 years in the form of the cold water upwelling and the whale migration it supported, and that the borings had gone directly through it. She was not certain of this. She was following a line of evidence that began in her father's notebooks and ran through her own logs and arrived at a conclusion she couldn't prove. But the whales were late for the 3rd year, this time by a full month. She submitted her logbook data to the State Environmental Review as a formal public comment, not a summary, the actual logs. 14 volumes of her father's records and 26 of her own, totaling 40 years of whale migration timing data for the Penobscot Sound crossing. She included a cover letter explaining the deviation in arrival timing over the previous 3 seasons, the correlation with the upwelling schedule, and the sequence of exploratory borings she had logged in the East Basin. The developer's marine impact assessment arrived in the public record 2 weeks later. It showed no significant disruption to whale transit patterns in the Sound. Nora read it carefully. She understood why. The assessment had been conducted over 14 months, beginning 8 months after the exploratory borings. The baseline period, the window they used to define normal whale behavior in the Sound, started after the timing deviation she had been logging. Her data predated their baseline by more than 5 decades. The review board had no way of knowing that the 14 months they used as a reference showed a pattern that was already different from the 50-year norm, because the 50-year norm was in a wooden box in her wheelhouse, and no one had asked to see it. She made a second submission to the review board, a chart this time, a single sheet hand-drawn, showing whale arrival timing from 1971 to present, with the deviation beginning 3 years earlier marked clearly. She wrote a 1-paragraph explanation at the bottom. She kept it short, the way her father had taught her. Say the thing plainly and let people decide. The review board acknowledged receipt. They did not change the assessment. Construction was approved. She told herself she might be wrong. This was harder than it should have been, because she had spent 26 years being right about this Sound, and rightness was a kind of muscle that atrophied when you doubted it too much. But she had also been wrong before, had misread a late fog bank as a weather system, had predicted the herring run 2 weeks early one season, and missed it entirely. The sea did not guarantee expertise. It only rewarded attention. Maybe the whales were responding to something else. Maybe the upwelling timing had shifted for reasons entirely unrelated to the borings, a change in the regional temperature gradient, a shift in prevailing current patterns. Any number of things she couldn't see from a ferry wheelhouse. The Sound was not a simple system. She was not the only variable. She ran the crossing every day and wrote in her log and watched the water. In the second summer after approval, the upwelling arrived 6 weeks late. And when it came, it was thin. That was the word she wrote in her log. Thin, not a technical term, but the right one. The upwelling she had been crossing through for 26 years had a quality to it. A temperature drop she felt in the air before she could measure it on any instrument. A change in the water color from the gray-green of the surface layer to the deep, particular blue-gray of cold water coming up from below. It was textured and abrupt, the way boundaries are when two very different things meet. This upwelling was none of those things. It was a softening rather than a boundary, a reluctant cooling rather than a surge. The whales did not come through the sound that summer. For the first time in the data, going back to 1971, Nora logged a June with no whale sightings in the sound. She called a marine biologist named Dr. Ames, who worked out of the University of Maine's oceanography program. She had met him 2 years earlier at a coastal fisheries forum where she had submitted the logbook data as part of a different context entirely, and he had spent 20 minutes asking her questions about her father's temperature records before she had to leave to make the afternoon crossing. She described what she had seen over 4 seasons: the delayed upwelling, the thinning, the summer with no whales. He said, "Can I come out on the boat?" He came the following Tuesday. He brought a small CTD instrument, a device that measured water conductivity, temperature, and depth at various points in the water column, and he took readings at 6 stations across the sound, including 2 directly over the East Basin. He took the readings quietly. He did not say anything for a long time after he collected the data. Then he said, "The thermocline is 15 meters higher than it should be." Nora asked what that meant in plain language. He said it meant the cold water layer that drives the upwelling had shifted upward. It was still there, but it was thinner than you would expect, and it was sitting higher in the water column than it should be for the time of year. If the thermal reservoir beneath it had been compromised, if the dense cold water substrate had been breached in some way, you would expect to see exactly this pattern. The reservoir would slowly lose its capacity to maintain the temperature differential, and the upwelling would weaken and shift upward before eventually becoming insufficient to drive the migration pattern above it. He said he would need to do more sampling. He came back 3 more times over the following 2 months. What he found, across 4 sampling sessions, was consistent with what Nora had been logging from the surface. The thermal reservoir in the East Basin showed clear evidence of physical disruption, not catastrophic, not emptied or destroyed, but breached. The bore sites from the exploratory assessment had penetrated the dense cold water substrate, and the penetration had created pathways through which the cold water was slowly dissipating upward rather than holding in the basin where the seasonal temperature differential needed it. It was a slow process, gradual, the kind of thing that took years to become undeniable. The developer's impact assessment had measured the sound's thermal profile at the surface and at standard mid-column depths. It had not measured the basin floor reservoir. The assessment had not known to look for it, because it had not known it was there. Her father had noted it in 1974. His notation was in a logbook in a wooden box in a Ferry wheelhouse. No one had asked. Dr. Ames filed a formal report with the State's Department of Marine Resources. The report documented the thermal disruption in the East Basin and established a correlation with the boring sites. It cited Nora's logbook data as the only long-term baseline record available for whale migration timing in the Sound. 40 years of observations predating and post-dating the disruption. The developer contested the report, not dishonestly. Their own oceanographers reviewed Dr. Ames's methodology and found it technically sound, but argued that the thermal changes were within the natural variation of the basin's temperature cycle. They were not wrong that natural variation existed. They were wrong about its magnitude. It took another full season to establish the distinction. The second formal study, commissioned by the state after the initial report created enough concern to warrant it, included bottom-mounted temperature sensors deployed directly on the basin floor over an 8-month period. The sensors recorded the thermal reservoir's behavior in real time, across seasons, in the zone immediately adjacent to the bore sites. The data was unambiguous. The reservoir was dissipating, not uniformly. The bore sites were creating localized pathways of cold water loss, and the areas of the reservoir furthest from the bore sites were still intact. But the net effect, measured across 8 months, was a reservoir that was losing its thermal capacity at a rate that would, within 12 to 15 years, reduce the upwelling to below the threshold needed to support the whale migration corridor. The state ordered a modified foundation design for the turbine array. The 4 bore sites in the East Basin were sealed with engineered grout. The turbine foundations in the deepest basin zone were relocated to the shallower western margin, where the substrate was bedrock without the thermal reservoir layer. It added cost. It added construction time. It changed the array's configuration in ways that reduced its energy output slightly. It was what was possible. Nora had made enough crossings to understand the difference between what you hoped for and what you could work with. She had crossed the sound in fog so thick she navigated by depth and compass alone, and she had crossed it in November gales that turned the 4-mile passage into 45 minutes of controlled endurance, and she had crossed it on the days when the water was flat and the air was cold and a humpback whale broke the surface 40 feet off the port bow in perfect silence. And that was a crossing that mattered, the one that made the fog and the gales into a reasonable price. She had logged all of it. In the spring following the remediation, the upwelling arrived in the 3rd week of May, not as strong as it had been. The reservoir was recovering, Dr. Ames said, but recovery was measured in years, not seasons. The thermal capacity that had been lost would rebuild slowly, at the same geological pace at which it had originally formed. You could not speed that up. You could only stop making it worse and wait. Nora made the crossing on the morning of the 22nd of May. The sound was flat and gray and cold in the way it was cold when the upwelling was running, a specific quality of cold that had nothing to do with air temperature and everything to do with what was coming up from below. She felt it before the instrument registered it. She had felt it this way every spring for 26 years. And the 2 seasons when it had not come, it felt like something missing that she could not name to anyone who had not also felt it. It was back, thin, still, present. She wrote in her log, May 22nd, upwelling running. Cold front from the basin, southwest corner. Temperature drop at the usual position, 15 minutes earlier than yesterday. Watercolor changing. She was writing the next sentence when Petrie knocked on the wheelhouse door and said, "There's something off the port bow." She looked up. The humpback was moving northeast, unhurried, its breath a brief pale column against the gray sky. Then it was gone. She finished the log entry. She wrote the position, the heading, the time. Then she went back to the beginning of the season's log and wrote at the top of the first page, in the margin, the way her father used to mark an important entry. They came back. The state's formal review of the incident included a section on historical baseline data and its role in the investigation. Nora's logbooks were cited 16 times. Her father's logs were cited 9. The review board's final report included a recommendation, not a requirement, but recommendation, that future offshore development assessments in Maine coastal waters include solicitation of long-term observation, records from commercial ferry and fishing operators working the affected areas. The developer's lead environmental consultant, a careful woman named Ms. Harrington, who had been the one to contest Dr. Ames's initial findings and who had, once the sensor data came in, been the one to formally acknowledge they were wrong, sent Nora a letter. It was professional and brief and said the things that letters like that said. At the end, she had added a handwritten note. It said, "I've been doing this work for 19 years. I didn't know about the thermal reservoir because I didn't know to look for it. Your father knew. He wrote it down in 1974. That's a long time to carry something nobody asked about." Nora read the note twice. She put it in the logbook, beside the entry for the day the whales came back. She closed the book. She went to make the afternoon crossing. The sound did what it had always done. Cold water rising from the basin, warming at the surface. The thermal boundary moving through the 4-mile passage the way boundaries moved when 2 patient things finally agreed on a line. The whales knew what a line was. They had known it since before anyone thought to write it down. Nora's father had written it down in 1974. And somewhere in the sound, in water cold enough to carry the memory of a glacier, the record continued.